The legendary singer is facing a new and far more daunting challenge.
How the brain disease has silenced one of the most iconic voices in pop music and how she is doing today.
It used to make me get really into a good voice, and somehow it wasn't happening. I was struggling with pitch.
Come what may to Blue Bayou.
They called her the voice of an era, a woman who could glide from a country twang to a rock, scream and land in an aching whisper that could shatter your heart in 3 syllables. Linda Ronstadt wasn't just a singer, she was a force of nature, and for a while it felt like her voice could do anything. But one night, under the heat of stage lights and the weight of decades of music behind her, something felt wrong. Her band began to play the opening chords of Blue Bayou.
My baby behind on Blue Bayou.
It was a song she'd sung 1,000 times, a song that had carried her around the world. The crowd was electric, fans holding up records, photos, flowers, all waiting for that familiar sound. And then Linda opened her mouth, and the sound that came out wasn't the same. The notes trembled. The power she'd always summoned so easily wasn't there. Her throat felt tight, her breath too short. She pressed on, like a soldier on a familiar battlefield, hiding the panic behind her signature smile. But inside, she knew. Something deep within her had shifted. Her voice, the one thing that had always been there, was slipping away, and she didn't know why. The audience cheered. They couldn't tell the difference, but Linda could. And that night, when the lights went out and the applause faded, she sat alone backstage, staring at her reflection in the mirror, mouthing the words that had once come so effortlessly. She tried again. Still wrong, still weaker. And in that quiet dressing room, Linda Ronstadt felt something she hadn't felt in her entire career. Fear. Because for Linda, singing wasn't just a talent, it was her identity. It was how she spoke to the world. It was how she survived it. For years, she hid what was happening, from fans, from friends, even from herself. She blamed exhaustion, overwork, maybe just getting older, but deep down, she knew the truth was waiting, and it terrified her. It wasn't until she turned 63 that she finally said it aloud, the truth that broke her heart and the hearts of everyone who had ever loved her music. The moment Linda Ronstadt confessed that she could no longer sing, this is the story of Linda Ronstadt, the woman whose voice defined a generation, and the moment the silence began to swallow it. Before we continue, if you've ever been moved by her songs, if long time,
Long time.
or Blue Bayou still stop you in your tracks,
Come what may to Blue Bayou.
make sure you're subscribed to RetroWaves, because this isn't just another story about fame or fortune. It's about what happens when the very thing that makes you who you are starts to fade away. And how Linda Ronstadt found peace in the silence she once feared most. Linda's story didn't start under the bright lights of Hollywood or New York. It began in Tucson, Arizona, in a family home filled with music and dust and desert air. Her mother played the piano, her father sang old Mexican canciones, and before she could even ride a bike, Linda was harmonizing to the radio. By the time she was a teenager, her voice already carried a kind of ache, the kind that can't be taught. People said she could sing a phone book and still make it sound beautiful, but she didn't see herself as special, just a girl who wanted to sing songs that felt true. When she moved to Los Angeles in the mid-1960s, she was shy, soft-spoken, and barely scraping by. She played in coffee houses and tiny clubs, sometimes for crowds that didn't even clap, but the people who did listen never forgot her voice. There was something raw in it, something human. Then came the Stone Ponies. Then different drum, and suddenly, that shy girl from Tucson was the voice of a new generation.
So don't get me wrong, it's not that I knock it, it's just that I...
By the mid-1970s, Linda Ronstadt was everywhere, her face on the cover of Rolling Stone, her album selling millions, her concerts selling out in minutes. She wasn't just famous, she was untouchable. But the truth was, Linda never wanted to be a superstar. She loved music, not fame. She hated the noise, the control, the constant image-making. She hated that every headline seemed to be about what she wore, who she dated, how she looked. In interviews, she was honest, sometimes too honest for the industry's liking. She said fame felt like a costume she couldn't take off, and yet she kept singing. Because when she was on stage, the noise faded, the pressure disappeared. All that mattered was the song. But with each year, the demands grew. The touring, the recording, the rehearsals, the endless expectations of a world that wanted her to stay perfect forever. She pushed herself harder than anyone asked her to, a perfectionist chasing a sound that could never be caught twice, and though her voice still sounded flawless to the world, she began to feel something she couldn't explain. A tremor, a hesitation, a sense that her body was no longer keeping up with her heart. No one knew it then, but the first cracks were already forming, not just in her voice, but in her confidence. Linda had spent her life defining herself by sound, and now something inside her was warning her that sound wouldn't last forever. She once said in an interview, "I was terrified of losing my voice. It was the only thing I had that was truly mine." That fear, quietly growing inside her for years, became her shadow, always behind her, even in her brightest moments. But when the spotlight hit her, she buried it. She smiled, sang her heart out, and gave the world everything she had. Because for Linda Ronstadt, silence was never an option, until it became one. That's where her story truly begins. Not in fame, not in glory, but in the quiet realization that the thing that made her who she was slipping away. By the early 1980s, Linda Ronstadt had everything the industry could offer: awards, sold-out tours, critical acclaim, but she also had something no one could see, a quiet exhaustion that never went away. She'd spent more than a decade running from one stage to another, one studio to the next, chasing perfection, chasing approval, chasing a sound that lived only in her head. The industry called her unstoppable, but behind the curtain, Linda was running on fumes. Every night, she'd step off stage drenched in sweat, her voice strained, her nerves frayed. She'd smile for the cameras, sign autographs, wave to the fans, and then retreat to her hotel room, where the silence hit harder than any applause. She once said, "I never learned to rest. I only knew how to work." That became her curse, because the world didn't see the woman, they saw the legend, the perfect voice, the star who could switch genres like changing clothes. But Linda knew perfection was a fragile illusion. One wrong note, and the illusion would shatter. So she pushed harder, tour after tour, recording after recording, and the more she gave, the more the world demanded. Producers pushed for new albums, managers pushed for bigger shows, magazines pushed for headlines, and Linda, who had always lived to please the music, not the machine, started feeling trapped by the very thing she loved. She began noticing little things. Her voice didn't recover as fast. Her breathing was heavier. Some nights she felt her hands shake. Her voice teacher told her to slow down, but she brushed it off. She told herself it was just fatigue, the cost of greatness. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. It wasn't just her body, it was her spirit. She started to dread the stage, not because she didn't love singing, but because she feared she couldn't live up to the version of herself the world expected. Every time she sang, she wondered if this performance would be the one where they noticed that she wasn't the same. The critics had always praised her for her control, that impossible precision, that perfect tone. But perfection is a heavy burden. It leaves no room for weakness, no room for being human. And Linda Ronstadt was only human, a human with a voice that was beginning to betray her. Still, she didn't stop. When her rock career began to feel suffocating, she reinvented herself completely. She sang Broadway standards, mariachi ballads, and even classical songs, and somehow she mastered them all. The industry thought she was fearless, but the truth, she was fighting to stay ahead of what she couldn't control. Every new challenge was a way to outrun the quiet truth inside her, that her voice wasn't the same anymore. And as she conquered every genre, every audience, the cracks began to widen. There were nights when she couldn't hit certain notes she'd once reached effortlessly. Her throat would tighten, her breath would cut short, her tongue wouldn't move the way it used to. Her friends noticed, but Linda brushed it off. She said it was allergies, or exhaustion, or age, anything but what it really was, the beginning of the end of her voice. She once described singing as like flying, but now it felt like falling, slowly, silently, and with no way to stop it. In interviews, she still sounded composed, confident, but when she went home at night, she began to avoid the piano, avoid the studio, even avoid singing along to the radio. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was grief. The kind of grief only an artist can know, the loss of something invisible but vital, the loss of what made her herself. For years, she stayed quiet. Even as the symptoms grew worse, her hands shook when she tried to write, her voice faltered when she tried to sing. But she didn't want to believe it was anything serious, because if it was, then it meant the one thing she couldn't bear to face. By her early 60s, she had already started to withdraw from public life. No more touring, no more recording, just silence. Fans wondered what had happened. Rumors spread about retirement, burnout, even secret illness. But Linda said nothing, until one day she finally did. It was 2013. She was 63 years old. And after years of silence, she sat down for an interview and told the truth the world wasn't ready to hear. "I can't sing anymore," she said quietly. "I have Parkinson's disease." The room fell silent. Even the interviewer didn't know what to say. Linda smiled softly, not out of peace, but out of acceptance, because by the time she spoke those words, she had already mourned the loss. She said she first noticed it years earlier, when her voice began to fail her in subtle ways. The strength was gone. The control had vanished. At first, she thought it was something simple, maybe acid reflux or fatigue, but it wasn't. It was the early stages of Parkinson's, a cruel, invisible thief that slowly took her coordination, her strength, and eventually, the one thing that had always defined her, her ability to sing. She described it simply: "No matter how hard I tried, my voice wouldn't obey me anymore." And for a singer like Linda Ronstadt, that was like losing a limb or a lifetime of memory. The world was heartbroken. Fans who had grown up with her music couldn't imagine a world where Linda couldn't sing. But for Linda, it wasn't about fame anymore. It was about acceptance. She said she'd spent her entire life being the woman with that voice, the one who could make a stadium cry. But Parkinson's forced her to find herself again, without the sound that had defined her. And yet, even as her voice faded, her spirit didn't. She learned to speak differently, to express herself through stories, through advocacy, through memory. She found new music in the silence. But the story doesn't end with that confession, because after she revealed the truth, something unexpected happened, something that would remind the world what made Linda Ronstadt extraordinary, even without her voice. When Linda Ronstadt finally said the words, "I can't sing anymore," the world seemed to stop. It wasn't just a confession, it was a farewell, a quiet end to one of the most beautiful sounds the world had ever known. For fans who had followed her since the beginning, it felt impossible. How could the woman who once filled stadiums with her voice now struggle to sing even a lullaby? But for Linda, it wasn't sudden. It was the truth she'd carried in silence for years, and now at last she let it out. The reaction was instant. Headlines across the world called it the day the voice went silent. Friends and fellow musicians reached out, heartbroken, stunned, but none of them could truly understand what it felt like to lose something so deeply tied to who you are. She told one interviewer, "When I first realized I couldn't sing, it was like saying goodbye to a part of myself." And those who knew her said she grieved it like a death, because that's what it was, the death of her voice, and with it the end of a lifetime of sound. In the months that followed, Linda's world grew quieter. The music industry moved on, as it always does, but for her, time seemed to slow. Every day she woke up and felt the same ache, the instinct to sing, and the painful reminder that she couldn't. At first she tried to fight it. She hummed softly in private, hoping that maybe, somehow, her voice would come back. But it never did. And soon she stopped trying. She said later, "I miss it terribly, but I can't do anything about it. I had a long run." There was no bitterness in her words, just acceptance, spoken by someone who had lived her dream longer than most ever do. But behind that calm, there was loss, a deep, aching silence where once there had been songs. For decades, her voice had been her way of speaking to the world. It had carried her pain, her passion, her truth. Without it, she had to learn to speak differently, to live differently, to find meaning beyond the music. And yet there was something quietly beautiful about what came next, because in losing her voice, Linda began to rediscover herself. She started writing, reflecting, telling stories. She revisited old recordings, not as a performer, but as a listener. She said she could still feel the music, even if she couldn't create it anymore. Friends noticed that her speaking voice, though quieter, still carried warmth and authority. Her eyes still lit up when she talked about songs, as if the melody still lived inside her somewhere. And maybe it did, because the truth is, Linda's voice never really disappeared, it just changed. After her confession, she began to speak openly about Parkinson's. She became an advocate for awareness, helping others face their diagnoses with strength and grace. She said she didn't want pity, only understanding. Her courage struck people in a way her music once had. Because here was a woman who had already conquered the world, now showing what it looked like to lose everything and still stand tall. In interviews, she was as candid as ever, brutally honest, but never defeated. She spoke about the loneliness of fame, the fleeting nature of talent, and the beauty of aging gracefully, even when the world no longer applauds you. "I had a long career," she said. "I sang everything I wanted to sing, and now I just have to learn how to listen." Those words became her new anthem, one of acceptance, not surrender. But not everyone realized how hard that acceptance came. There were nights when Linda would dream she was on stage again, the lights bright, the band behind her, the audience singing along. And in those dreams, her voice was still strong. She could still hit every note, but when she woke up, the silence would return, heavy, humbling, real. Her closest friends said she never complained. She simply found other ways to fill her days: reading, writing, spending time with her children, and surrounding herself with the sounds of others. She became a listener to life, to laughter, to the echoes of the music she once made, and somehow that brought her peace. In time, the world came to see her differently, not just as the woman who lost her voice, but as the woman who proved that art is more than talent. It's resilience, it's honesty, it's the courage to exist without applause. Because even when she could no longer sing, Linda Ronstadt still had something to say. Her silence spoke louder than her songs ever could. She said once, "Music lives in the memory. It doesn't disappear just because you can't perform it anymore." And maybe that's the truest thing she ever sang, without ever singing it. In 2019, when she was honored at the Kennedy Center, she didn't perform. She simply sat in the audience, smiling softly as others sang her songs. The spotlight shone, not on her voice, but on her legacy. It was a strange moment for fans who remembered her on stage, fiery, unstoppable, radiant. But for Linda, it was enough, because she had finally made peace with the silence. When the applause filled the theater, she clapped along, no longer the singer, but the story, and maybe that's how she wanted it. For decades, Linda Ronstadt sang with a kind of fearless honesty that no machine, no trend, no illness could ever imitate, and even though her voice is gone, her truth remains, because the measure of an artist isn't how long their voice lasts, it's how deeply it's felt when it's gone. Linda Ronstadt's music still echoes, in vinyl grooves, in radio airwaves, in the hearts of those who grew up under her spell. And though she can no longer sing those words herself, her songs still speak for her. They always will. So the next time you hear Blue Bayou,
And the world is my Blue Bayou.
for a long, long time, listen closely.
But there's no one in my side.
You might notice something you missed before: the tremble, the ache, the humanity in her tone. That's not just a singer performing, that's a soul remembering. Because Linda Ronstadt didn't lose her voice. She gave it to us, and we're still listening. If this story moved you, if you still remember that voice that could stop time, make sure you're subscribed to RetroWaves. Because behind every legend, there's a moment the world never sees, and sometimes the silence that follows says the most. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest goodbyes. And for Linda Ronstadt, silence became more than just absence. It became understanding. In the years after her confession, she began to see her voice differently. It wasn't something she had lost. It was something she had lived. She once said, "Your voice is like a soul you carry in sound. When it's gone, you learn to listen differently." And that's exactly what she did. Linda became a student of silence, not afraid of it, but curious about it. She learned to hear things she'd missed before: the rhythm of footsteps in her garden, the melody of her children's laughter, the quiet hum of the desert wind outside her California home. It was all music, in its own way, just a different kind. People still ask her how it feels to have been one of the greatest singers alive and then lose the ability to sing. She doesn't hesitate. She says, "It's sad, but it's also life. Nothing stays." There's a kind of peace in that answer, not resignation, but wisdom, the kind that comes from having seen both sides of the stage, the roaring crowd and the empty hall, the spotlight and the shadow. Linda Ronstadt understood something most artists never do, that a legacy isn't built from how long you shine, but from how deeply you touch others while you do. And by that measure, she never stopped singing. Her albums still find new listeners. Young artists still cover her songs, trying to capture that impossible mix of tenderness and power. But they all admit the same thing: no one could do what Linda did, because her voice wasn't just sound, it was truth. She didn't perform songs, she lived them. When she sang You're No Good, you could hear the anger, but also the ache.
You're no good. I'm gonna say it again. You're no good.
When she sang Long, Long Time, you felt the loneliness between every breath.
Long, long time.
And when she sang Blue Bayou, you didn't just hear longing, you remembered it.
Come what may to Blue Bayou.
That was her gift. She didn't make you admire her, she made you feel her. And that feeling, the ache, the humanity, that's what stays long after the music ends. Even now, decades later, her influence is everywhere, from country to rock to Latin music. Every artist who blends genres owes something to Linda Ronstadt. She made it okay to be undefinable, to not fit in a box, to follow the emotion, not the marketing. And maybe that's what makes her story so powerful. Because even in silence, Linda's defiance never faded. She still refused to be what others expected. She still lived by her own rhythm. That's what made her timeless. As her illness progressed, Linda withdrew from the spotlight. But she didn't disappear. She still appeared in documentaries, wrote her memoir, and spoke openly about her journey, not with pity, but with perspective. She said, "I'm just grateful I got to do it. A lot of people never get to find their voice. I got to live mine." Those words linger, simple, humble, and profound. Because in a world obsessed with fame, youth, and perfection, Linda Ronstadt's greatest act wasn't her success, it was her acceptance. She showed that art doesn't end when the applause fades. Sometimes, that's when it begins to mean the most. There's something poetic about her story, that the woman whose voice defined a generation would spend her later years surrounded by silence. But maybe that silence isn't tragic, maybe it's sacred, because in the quiet, her songs still live. In every radio replay, in every karaoke night, in every person who still hums Blue Bayou, without realizing why it makes them tear up, Linda's voice is there. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear her, not singing, but smiling, because she knows the truth now. A voice may fade, but the soul behind it never does. When asked once if she missed the stage, Linda smiled and said, "No, I don't. I've already been there. I got to do everything I wanted." It wasn't bitterness. It was peace. The kind of peace that only comes when you've given the world everything you had, and the world keeps listening anyway. So maybe this isn't the story of a woman who lost her voice. Maybe it's the story of a woman who found something deeper, the music that exists beyond sound, the kind that lives in silence, in memory, in the space between every note she ever sang. Because Linda Ronstadt's voice didn't vanish. It transformed into legacy, into feeling, into something the world still hears without even realizing it. And that is the kind of immortality only true artists ever find. If Linda's story touched you, remember to subscribe to RetroWaves, because here, every song has a story, every legend has a secret,